Welcome to part 4 of Chinese religion. This video focuses on the religion of the Warring States period, specifically how the philosophical thinking during this period had an influence on Chinese religion. The Warring States period lasted from around 475 to 221 BC. During this period, China was divided into independent states, each of which had their own king. The Zhou king still nominally had authority over all of China. The capital of the Zhou king, which in ancient times was called Chengzhou, you can see it marked as Luoyang on this map, as it was later known. And the territory around the city of Luoyang was the only territory controlled by the Zhou kings. So they ruled a kind of small rump territory. The other states were fully independent, and they engaged in frequent warfare with each other. You can also see on the map early ancient versions of the walls of China that protected the western and northern borders from invasions by Central Asian nomads, people like the ancient Huns, later on Mongols and Mencius, etc. These walls would later be united by the first emperor of the Qin. So the state of Qin to the west eventually succeeded in conquering the other states and unifying China. But during this whole period, there was just conflict and what you could think of as sustained civil war. Mo Tzu was a very important philosopher during the Warring States period. The school of thought named after him is called Mo-Jia, also called Moism in English. He mainly focused on moral and political philosophy, although as we'll see, he had religious beliefs as well. Mo Tzu's ethics were focused on a concept of Jian-ai, which can be translated as impartial or universal, caring, or benevolence. The basic idea is that you should care about all people equally, regardless if they're personally related to you. So regardless if they're your friend or family member or not, they have equal moral value as humans. So that's kind of the basis of Mo Tzu's ethics. Now, Mo Tzu's ethics is often compared nowadays to Western ethical theories, in particular utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is the theory that the right action is the one that maximizes happiness for all people, or some other measure of benefit like well-being, which is sometimes defined in a way that's distinct from happiness per se. There are different varieties of utilitarianism, but one of the main things they have in common with the ethics of Mo Tzu is consequentialism. So utilitarianism is one type of consequentialist ethics. Consequentialist ethical theories hold that the moral rightness of an action depends on its consequences and not on some intrinsic property of the action itself or on some other factor. So for example, a consequentialist will believe that killing a person is morally justified if such a death could bring about more benefit than the harm involved. And this could include potentially even innocent people. So one example to illustrate this is the so-called trolley problem, which used to be mainly only known by moral philosophers, but now thanks to memes are fairly widely known. In the trolley problem, you have to decide whether you should divert a trolley or train which is about to run over 5 people. If you divert it, it will only kill 1 person. So if you are a consequentialist, you will probably say that the trolley should be diverted. You will kill the 1 to save the 5. Whereas many non-consequentialists would say that it's morally wrong to kill the 1 person because killing an innocent person is intrinsically wrong. There could be other types of reasoning for why it's rejected. But the important point is that Mo Tzu's ethics definitely count as a type of consequentialism because he tends to evaluate actions and policies and laws in terms of their consequences for society, specifically all humans. And the idea is you shouldn't be prejudicial in your caring. Moza's political philosophy is built upon his ethics. During the Warring States period, there were many schools of thought that emerged to try to give answers to the pressing political problems of the day. The disunity of China, the constant conflict, it was a state of disorder. There were people killed by the fighting, but also just by famines, by invasions. So it was a very difficult time. And one of the main types of philosophy was political philosophy that you would find in China. So Moza's theory was no different. His criterion for rulers is that the ruler should provide material benefit for all people. We can think of material benefit as including physical goods like food, shelter, clothing, other items like tools that you can possess, but also things like security from physical harm. So Moza had a kind of materialist focus in his ethics and in his political philosophy. These are concrete or physical things that can be measured empirically. Moza emphasized the importance of practical know-how. Unlike the Confucians, he did not think it was necessary for the ruler or his ministers to have an education in the classics or in the rituals and customs of the Zhou dynasty or other periods. So he seemed to look at politics as an engineering problem, similar to the way an engineer would design a machine to perform some practical function. The ruler is trying to craft or design policies to provide material benefit. That's the goal. And you can measure the effectiveness of different policies. You choose whichever policy produces the most material benefit. You can also see these policies being evaluated in consequentialist terms. And it's not just material benefit for the ruler, it's material benefit for all of the subjects of the ruler because they all have equal moral value. So there's a story told about Moza that he was a military engineer. And if this is true, it provides a kind of context to why he would be thinking in such practical or technical terms. We do know that his followers often hired themselves out as military advisors and strategists for rulers, and this may seem odd. His goal, though, was to provide peace to all of China. And his view was that warfare is one of the main destroyers of material benefit for people for obvious reasons. You have the people directly killed in the fighting. You also have the fact that war leads to destruction of property, to random thefts, murders, rapes. You have the fact that warfare often leads to famines. So he regarded it as one of the main threats to the material well-being of society. However, Moza thought very kind of strategically. His thinking is that rulers are not going to stop fighting unless they saw it was no longer in their self-interest. So even though he thought they should ideally be motivated by the benefit of all society, he realized that most rulers were thinking in terms of their self-interest, at least primarily. So he sought to make warfare costly to rulers. Moza and his followers both had this idea that if they could improve the defenses of cities and of kingdoms generally, then the advantage would always be with the defender. It would reduce the advantage of trying to attack or invade rival kingdoms. So once again, he's thinking very practically and pragmatically here. And it was interesting that there was basically this whole class of Maoist military engineers and strategists who were very important in designing fortifications during the Warring States period, although it did not seem to have the result that Moza had intended of producing a universal peace by making warfare too costly. This picture is not sadly from a wall of the Warring States period, but It's a picture of a later fortification that is suggestive to the type of thing that Mozi and his followers would have been designing. So, as I mentioned earlier, Mozi did have religious beliefs, and he thought these were very important. They were an important part of his political and social philosophy. He taught that there is a supreme spirit, heaven, supreme heavenly Lord, Tian, who rules a whole hierarchy of lesser spirits, the Gui Shen. And Mozi thought that the heavenly Lord Tian and all of these spirits reward good people and punish wicked people. He thought this belief was very important for social order. I mean, he seemed to sincerely believe it himself, but he also thought that unless the people believe this, it would be very difficult to have an orderly, peaceful society. And the thinking here is that the ruler cannot always be around to punish and reward people. Rulers do need to provide punishments and rewards. That's a part of their job. But even with all the people serving the ruler, his soldiers, his ministers, etc., they can't be around to observe everyone in society all the time. It's impossible, practically speaking. However, if the people believe that there are invisible guardians of the cosmic order, like Tian and the spirits, that will punish or reward them based on their actions, then even when they're not being observed by the government, the people will still be moral and obedient. And so Mozi thought that this belief in a divine or cosmic justice and a belief in providence, the idea that the world is being governed by an intelligent and benevolent being, that's something that has to be widespread to have social order. So there was a religious aspect to his teachings that his followers also emphasized. So you can look at Mozi as kind of like an early philosophy or as an early religion, and it had a certain amount of organization to it, like a religious sect or order. Even though Moism eventually died out, it did have a lasting impact on Chinese religion. The belief that there is this supreme heavenly being, it did not originate with Mozi. It was present in earlier periods of Chinese history too, but it did become popular and widespread, at least probably in part because of ancient Moism. Also, Mozi really spelled out some more of the details of that heavenly or celestial hierarchy of spirits. So certain spirits are responsible for different spheres of nature or of society. And so they're basically given different domains of authority. Some spirits are responsible for looking at affairs in the heavens, others on the earth. On the earth, there's a differentiation between spirits who look over the rivers and the seas versus the mountains or the forest, etc. And so who you pray to is going to vary based upon what their authority is. And it's modeled very explicitly off of human society, human political institutions, where certain ministers are given authority over different bureaus or offices of the government, similar to how modern governments are organized. And then also the belief of divine reward and punishment became more widespread in Chinese religion, seemingly as the result of Moism. Also, there seems to have been a direct influence of the early Moists on Taoism. So, at least according to some accounts, the Moists were the first to really study metallurgy, which is kind of like the craft, the art, and to a certain extent the science or the precursor of the modern scientific understanding of metals, how to work them, how to combine them into alloys, what their properties are. Um, the Moists probably first got into metallurgy insofar as they were military engineers. They were creating war machines like catapults, ballistae, things that you could use to defend cities from attack. Um, and so they were working with metals, and it seems that at least some of them became involved in using metals to try to create elixirs or potions, like ancient medicines essentially, because of a belief that gold and cinnabar, which is a compound containing mercury, could be beneficial to your health. This idea, while it may have started with Moism, definitely had an influence on later Taoism, which had something called outer alchemy that involves creating potions, elixirs, medicines that would prolong your life or maybe even make you immortal. The picture on the right is of Tian, conceived of as a personal god, someone who has a human-like form and a human-like mind and rules from heaven. And indeed, it was that personal, anthropomorphic, human-like view of Tian, of Moism, that became influential on later Chinese religion. Also, during the Warring States period, there was the founding of an academy called the GSH Academy. You could think of it as the ancient analog of a modern think tank. In think tanks, you have funding given to scholars just to pursue research. This is kind of like scholars who work at a university, but in a university setting, the scholars would also be teaching as part of their duties. Whereas in think tanks, they're basically just given funds to pursue their research and maybe present it to others, but not necessarily having a formal teaching side of their job. That's similar to the way the GSH Academy worked. It was founded by King Xuan of Qi in his capital city, Linzi, and Qi was one of those warring states. So the peak of the GSH Academy was in the 4th century BC. There were scholars of many different schools of thought present at the GSH Academy, including Moists and Confucians. There were also scholars of two other schools, Yin-Yang Jia and Huanglao Jia. Yin-Yang Jia is one that we'll talk about after looking at the Confucians during this era. Yin-Yang Jia is philosophy focused on yin-yang theory, so the theory of those two forces of darkness and light, two different elements at the core of being, according to this school. They also developed the theory of the 5 phases or 5 elements. Huanglao was an early form of Taoism we'll talk about in the next video in this series. On the right is a picture of a modern reconstruction of what Linzi looked like in ancient times. The actual structures from that period don't survive. So Mencius, known in the West as Mencius, was one of the most important Confucians of the Warring States period. So Confucianism did survive the death of Confucius. He had kind of looked at himself as a bit of a failure because he did not succeed in gaining the ear of a prominent king and seeing his vision, his philosophy become established all throughout China. However, he had a whole generation of students he had taught, multiple generations, and they went on to teach other students. So his philosophy became one of the prominent schools of thought during the Warring States, and it would eventually become triumphant during the later Han Dynasty. But Mencius was one of the main followers of Confucius, and he indeed was at the GSH Academy. Mencius basically gave an addition to Confucius' thinking by providing a theory of human nature. Confucius himself did not directly discuss the issue of human nature, but this idea of what humans are fundamentally like in terms of their psychology, especially their moral psychology, became a hot topic during the Warring States period. Part of the reason for this seems to have been that the political philosophy, your advice that you would give to rulers as a scholar, would depend greatly on your theory of what humans are fundamentally like. According to Mencius, humans have a natural tendency towards goodness, towards virtue. He did not think that humans were born intrinsically good or intrinsically pure. However, he thought that human nature is naturally seeking to become good, to become virtuous. Goodness is a kind of perfection or development of human nature. We're only born with the seed or the sprout of that, and then we have to deliberately cultivate that through Confucian learning in order to actually become good human beings. So Meng Tse developed the theory of four main virtues. Those would be called the cardinal virtues or the heart virtues in Western thinking, but they're just the four main virtues of Meng Tse. He also thought that each of those virtues has its own specific sprout or seed that, if developed properly, will result in the virtue. So for Meng Tse, Ren is just one of these key important virtues. Confucius often used the term Ren or humane to refer to goodness or virtue in general, the sort of state of being of a perfected human. But Meng Tse and later Confucians gave it a somewhat more restricted meaning. So it's not goodness in general, it's the virtue of benevolence. So having concern for the well-being of others. The sprout of Ren could be called compassion. Perhaps a better translation would be empathy, which is the capacity to care about the feelings of others. So Meng Tse did not believe that humans are born with actual Ren, actual benevolence. We are born with the basic capacity for empathy. He gives a story to illustrate each of these virtues and their sprouts. The story he gives to illustrate Ren and its sprouts are: if you see a child about to crawl into a well and fall down the well to its death, you're probably going to have some concern for the child, some compassion, some regard, some fear for its suffering, even if it's not your child. Even if you don't know who the child is, you have no connection to the parents of the child or their family. So it's a total stranger to you, and yet you would have some empathy for it, even if you're a bad person. So Meng Tse is not saying that everyone is actually born good, or even born with a strong motivation to become good, but we have this ability, this capacity to have compassion and other virtues in us. The second key virtue is yi, which means uprightness or righteousness. And this means being able to follow rules or pursue virtues, even when it comes at a cost to your self-interest. So there's this idea that we have a kind of sense of dignity, that some actions are beneath us, even if they could benefit us. The story he gives to illustrate this is a beggar who's starving, who's hungry, who needs food or money. And a wealthy person comes by the beggar and gives the beggar money, but insults the beggar, maybe like spits in their face or something like that. Meng Tse says that the beggar may still be able to refuse the money, and indeed is likely to. Some people would still take the money even if they're insulted, but many people would feel that no, even at the personal cost, a great personal cost, their own suffering, their own hunger, they're not going to accept that tainted of a gift. It's tainted with disrespect. Out of a sense of shame, out of a sense of dignity, they're going to refuse it. And this could be true even if the beggar were not an especially virtuous or upright person in general. So what Meng Tse is trying to do is point to these key elements in human psychology that could serve as the basis, the foundation for a fully developed virtue. And like Confucius, he does see developing the virtue as a perfection of human nature, as what's already there. So the third key virtue is li, which can be translated as ritual or ceremony, but also as propriety or correctness in conduct. And you might think this is the one that requires most obviously social input. We don't really know what the rules of etiquette are or correct behavior unless we're taught by society. But even here, Meng Tse regards this as having a sprout that we're born with. And this is the inherent tendency to defer to or respect people who are above us. And the prime example of this is a child's natural deference towards their parents, and you might say towards older people in general. So there's this kind of idea that certain actions, certain ways of disrespecting others, of not behaving correctly around them, are going to be ruled out in a child's mind, even if they're not totally obedient. Let's face it, children are not. But many of them have a kind of natural respect to parents and other adults. And that, if you cultivate it, could become into this much broader virtue of Li. And then the fourth virtue is Qi, or wisdom. So this specifically refers to a kind of moral wisdom. It's knowledge not just of facts in general or theoretical knowledge, what's true and false, but knowing how to act, what is right, what is wrong. This has always been the main emphasis of Confucian wisdom, is a kind of moral wisdom. According to Mencius, the sprout of Qi is the ability to recognize good and bad, right and wrong, to approve and disapprove of things. And he thinks that all people, even children, have this capacity. So one thing to realize about Mencius' theory of the four virtues and their sprouts is that even though we're born with the sprouts, they require deliberate cultivation. And so that's the main work of this analogy, comparing them to sprouts or seeds. Just as a farmer cannot just throw some seeds around and expect them to grow on their own, you can't expect the sprouts or seeds of your virtue to grow without work. And what does the farmer have to do? They have to make sure the soil is fertilized, that the seeds get water, that they're protected from pests, from predators like, birds or mice stealing all the seeds. So they're doing a lot of work to cultivate those sprouts. And yet, if you think of the metaphor in another way, the seeds have an inherent innate tendency to want, in some sense, to grow towards the full plant. You could say, in some sense, the purpose or the goal of the seed is to grow into the full plant. And that's what Mencius thinks of the sprouts of virtue, that human nature, in some sense, wants to develop those sprouts, and that those virtues represent the fulfillment or the perfection of human nature. Later Confucians added a fifth cardinal virtue to Mencius' list of the four virtues, and this is worth mentioning. This virtue is called Lin, or sincerity. It basically means having the right attitude and state of mind when you're behaving correctly. So in other words, Confucians value not just acting correctly for the sake of acting correctly or acting correctly externally, but you also have to have the right attitude and state of mind for it really to be virtuous action. And this is something that Confucius himself had spoken about. He did not develop a specific list of the four or the five virtues, but he did have the concepts that were used in these lists by later Confucians, such as Mencius. With regards to sincerity, Confucius had spoken about the importance of performing rituals with the correct actions, but also with sincerity of feeling or emotions. You have to have the right reverential attitude when performing a ritual for it to have its desired effect. This picture on the right, by the way, is from a Korean Confucian temple. Confucianism traveled outside of China in later centuries to other countries in East Asia, Vietnam, Korea, and Japan. It's still more of a living tradition in Korea, in South Korea specifically, than it is in the People's Republic of China. And it's also recognized as a religion in South Korea. But this is just a picture to illustrate the idea of what a Confucian ritual can look like. So we also must talk about the concept of qi as it relates to the philosophy of Mencius. Qi is important to all of Chinese religion and philosophy. The literal meaning is steam or breath. Indeed, I've read that the character for qi, which you can see on the right, originally represented steam coming out of a pot with the lid on the top. And you can kind of see that still. There's a kind of lid at the top of the character, and below that boundary, that right angle, you can see this kind of burst of lines coming from the center, which could represent steam trying to escape from a pot. But it also means breath, the physical breath of a human body or other living creatures. Um, so it came over time to refer not just to literal physical steam or breath, but to a kind of vital energy that circulates, especially in living creatures, but also through nature generally. And we can experience it by looking within and these physical sensations that we have from the body, which in modern terms you could think of as nervous signals, signals being sent throughout the nervous system. These seem to be what's being referred to when Mencius and other Chinese philosophers and religious thinkers talk about qi. It's this combination of physical and mental sensations that we're experiencing in a constant flux or flow at all times. So, to illustrate the flowing aspect of qi, it's also often compared to or imagined as being like wind and water. And it's also believed to be literally present in physical wind and water as they're circulating throughout the world. Well, qi theory is especially associated with Taoism, not with Confucianism, but there are Confucian ideas of the role of qi in moral self-cultivation, and those basically go back to Mencius. So all Confucians believe in ethical self-cultivation, which is the deliberate and systematic cultivation of virtue. So the Confucian view of this is to cultivate virtue, you have to study ritual and classic texts. And then you can model yourself after some of the wise and virtuous people from the past. Mencius connected this theory of self-cultivation to qi. So he regards qi as one of the things that's being trained during self-cultivation, the main thing that's being trained. And how could this be connected to morality or virtue? Well, if you think about virtue, it involves having certain habits of mind with respect to your thoughts and feelings. Mencius's view seems to be that there's a kind of free-flowing, spontaneous element to your thinking and to your feelings. And this does fit with our ordinary experience, where we'll have thoughts and we'll have feelings that we're not consciously or deliberately planning necessarily. They're just kind of happening. So our thoughts and feelings have a kind of natural flow to them. However, we can partially direct and control that flow. And the partial directing and controlling is how Mencius thinks of self-cultivation. So when we're studying ritual, we're practicing ritual, and we're studying the classics, we're basically learning to direct our qi. And over time, this will cause the qi to be trained, so it naturally and spontaneously tends to flow in the right direction. We naturally have the right thoughts and feelings. He gives a parable of how not to do this, though. There's different pitfalls. One of the pitfalls is just not exercising any control at all. Just kind of trying to go with the flow, see where things go naturally. You are never going to get towards virtue. Your qi is just going to continue to flow in the current bad ways. However, Mencius thinks there's an opposite danger that a lot of people fall into, which is to over-control. You're trying to be too forceful or rigid in how you train the qi, you end up quashing it and killing it. So he gives an analogy of a farmer who wants his crops to grow and mature. However, his method for doing this is to tug at them, try to literally stretch them and pull them to get them to grow up faster. And all he succeeds in doing is tugging them up at the roots, which kills them. So there's this idea of Mencius that you have to work with the inherent nature of your vital energy when you're transforming yourself into a virtuous person. Another Confucian who was active during the Warring States period was Xunzi. Xunzi had an opposing view of human nature to Mencius. Even though they were both Confucians, they had different interpretations about human nature. Xunzi thought that human nature is basically selfish. So when we're born, we're completely self-interested. And in order to become virtuous, we have to go against our nature. So what a Confucian education consists in is like a series of bonds or restraints that prevent us from being our natural, selfish, bad self. And what's kind of interesting, if you think about Mengzi and Xunzi's views of human nature, they are contradictory. They both have insights, though. So you can even look at modern developmental psychology to try to test some of their predictions. On the one hand, it does seem that most humans are born with the capacity for empathy, a capacity to understand and care about, which are two separate things, the feelings of others. The main exception to this would be sociopaths or psychopaths. And yet, the fact that sociopaths and psychopaths are a small fraction of the population could still be regarded as giving some confirmation for Mengzi's view that the vast majority of people have the ability to empathize with the feelings of others. However, Xunzi is also seemingly vindicated by other research in modern psychology, which shows that the most violent humans are actually toddlers. And this is not because infants are less inherently violent than toddlers. It's because infants don't control their body well enough to attack others or their property. It's the terrible twos are when you have those selfish motives, that lack of concern for others, combined with some motor control. And that's when humans are most dangerous. And then most humans are able to learn to control their behavior. They're socialized into more pro-social behavior by people around them. So that fact seems to give some support for Xunzi's theory. So nevertheless, it shows that even among Confucians, there were debates about human nature. And because Confucius had not given a specific view himself, those debates continued for some time, although eventually Mengzi's view would become predominant. So Xunzi also had a view of religion. He was skeptical about the existence of gods and spirits. However, he thought you should still perform rituals because he thought they helped train your virtue and they had a good impact on society. If people are performing rituals, honoring these invisible beings, they're more likely to respect others, and that's going to contribute to social order. So this view of ritual, which emphasizes its benefit for or function in society, would be called functionalism by modern religious scholars or sociologists. Xunzi, he's often compared to the modern Western philosopher Thomas Hobbes in his kind of pessimism, you might say, about human nature. Thomas Hobbes was a psychological egoist. He was an English philosopher who lived in the 1600s. He wrote a work of political philosophy called the Leviathan. And in it, he taught that people are basically completely self-interested from birth. And so that was the starting point of his political philosophy. And that's seemingly similar to Xunzi's view that human nature is basically selfish. Now, there is a slight distinction between being selfish and self-interested. Selfish implies not just acting out of self-interest, but doing it in an excessive, immoral way. So perhaps Xunzi's view was something like we're born with this excessive, unchecked, unreflective self-interest that's too much and bad for society. Even if we never completely get rid of predominantly self-interested motivation, we can learn to train it and check it and channel it in a more socially useful way. Another very important school of thought during the Warring States period that was present at the GSH Academy was Yin-Yang Jia. This is literally the school or the house of yin-yang. They're also called the naturalists because they focused on what would be called in the West natural philosophy. That includes metaphysics and cosmology, a theory of the nature of reality and a theory of the overall structure of the world. Their yin-yang theory is heavily influenced by that in the Yi Jing, or Book of Changes. But they developed it into a whole philosophy of nature in which yin and yang are the two primal forces that combine in different patterns in nature. They also developed a theory called Wuxing, which means the 5 elements or the 5 phases. The term element makes it correspond more to the traditional Western or ancient Greek theory of the four elements, earth, air, water, fire, which is still somewhat well known today. But people who talk about the nature of wuxing emphasize the dynamic character of the xing. They are not static elements with fixed properties. They're more like phases of transformations in nature. So the theory of the five elements or the five phases also includes a theory of how they can produce or bring about each other and how they can overcome or destroy each other. You can see that reflected in the diagram on the right. So the outer series of gray arrows is representing how each phase or element can produce another element. The red inner arrows show how each element can destroy or overcome another element. And let's walk our way through these phases to illustrate the thinking of these yin-yang theorists. Water is said to nourish or generate wood because plants need water to grow. So a lot of these are kind of intuitive, impressionistic ways of understanding the relation between these elements. Wood generates or nourishes fire because wood is a common fuel for fire. Fire generates earth, presumably because fire can burn things that then turn into dust or ash or earth-like particles. Earth nourishes metal because there's a belief in this cosmology that metals are basically grown deep in the earth, which in some sense is not far from the truth. It relates to the fact that miners can uncover, veins of ore. So it may seem like the earth is nourishing or generating these metals. And then perhaps the most obscure one is the teaching that metal nourishes or generates water. And this is apparently connected to some idea that natural springs and other underground sources of water have some relation to metal. And in fact, many deposits of ores got there by flowing water. So you can see a kind of intuitive linking between these different elements. Also connected to aspects of everyday experience, like if you dig deep enough into the earth, you find water there, as well as metal. There's a water table, that water comes out of springs from the earth, etc., things like that. As far as the overcoming cycle, water overcomes fire because it puts it out. Fire overcomes metal because it can melt metal. Metal overcomes wood because metal tools like axes can chop through wood. Wood overcomes earth because wooden tools like hoes can move earth. And earth overcomes water because earthen embankments can be used to block floods. So you can see it's a very kind of impressionistic, common sense way of linking these elements together. There also was an entire elaborate system of correspondences that developed out of the theory of the five elements. This table just shows a few aspects of this. Each element was associated with a different direction: east, south, west, north, or center. So wood is associated, and with a different season. Wood was associated with the east and with spring. Fire is associated with south and with summer, and you can see the kind of logic behind these associations. From the perspective of the northern hemisphere, which is where China was located, the further you travel south, the warmer it tends to become. And so it would be associated with the fire element and with the summer or warm season. Earth is associated with the center and with an in-between part of the cycle of seasons. So the Earth was associated especially with China, with the earth around the Yellow River. That's why the earth element is associated with the color yellow as well. And so it's the kind of center of the cosmos symbolically. Metal is associated with the west and with autumn, and water is associated with the north and winter. And this, even though Yin-Yang school eventually died out as the independent school of thought, the theory of the five elements, even the system of correspondences, became adapted into other schools of thought and religions. So Taoism and Confucianism, it became kind of like a part of the lore taught by scholars in China and incorporated into religious cosmology as well, and into Chinese medicine.